You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. We've all had many different teachers in our lifetimes, some better than others. But there's always that one that really just stands out from the rest. They love the material, and you can see in the way that they present it that they understand it better than most other people, and they're able to communicate it in a way that makes sense. For me, that was my freshman year of high school history teacher. Now, I've always been interested in history, but up until that point, I just knew different facts about historical events. There was something about this guy, though, and when I tell you he was the most monotone, emotionless person that has ever stood behind a podium, I am not joking. Yet there was something about him where he knew his material, and you could tell that he loved it, even though he didn't show it through any facial expression. But he really understood history, and he was able to communicate it in a way that made me see the bigger picture of history that I had never seen before. And something in my mind clicked during that semester. I have never looked at history the same way since. For most people, that has never happened in regards to the Bible. You can go to church on a Sunday morning and hear a sermon about, say one of the parables of Jesus. And then you can go back on Sunday night and hear part of a series on Revelation. And then maybe you go back again during the middle of the week and you get a devotional out of Psalms. And you have all of these little pockets of Bible stories that are their own individual thing. There's never any greater connection between them. And that's a shame because it's not wrong or bad to know Bible stories in and of themselves, but there is a big picture to the Bible that makes the whole thing shine as an incredible work of art. This week, we're going to look at the Bible in that way. We are going to trace some themes that show up here in Genesis 8, all the way through the rest of the Bible. And this is the sort of thing that Bible study was made for. It will change the way you view this chapter forever. Let's get into it. Chapter 8, we have been going through the flood story. And if you have not yet listened to chapters 6 and 7, I definitely recommend going back. Also, we have the stuff you don't know about chapter 7 through 11. They get into a lot of the bigger picture questions that people tend to ask when they hear about the flood. Topics like how long it lasted, how much of the earth it covered, and even connections to other flood mythologies. This week in chapter 8, we're going to get into some details that aren't usually covered in the flood story. This is kind of an overlooked chapter. Because a lot of times people will look at chapter 6 and 7, they're the lead up to the flood, and then sometimes you'll get the end of this chapter where Noah sacrifices, but there's a lot of really interesting details here that I think that we can pull out and cover. So let's hop right into this with actually a bit of a controversy right here in verse 1. Genesis 8 verse 1 reads, "And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all of the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged." Now, let's look at this idea of God remembering Noah, because most Christians have an idea that God is omniscient, omni meaning all and siri meaning to know, so all-knowing. So if God knows everything, how can he remember something? Because remembering something implies that you can forget something. And if you know everything, you can't really forget something. And maybe this would be okay if it wasn't for the fact that God is often also believed to be omnipresent, present everywhere. So if you are both all-knowing and present everywhere, you're not going to be able to forget about someone in a particular part of the world. Now, most commentaries that you would look at will very quickly write this off as saying, well, God didn't actually forget Noah. This is just a way of saying that he thought about him. Okay, but the word here, sakar in Hebrew, it does mean to remember. So I think that we have to wrestle with this a little bit more than just saying, well, it doesn't actually mean that. Sometimes you'll get other commentators say that the word means more so to act on something. So it's not necessarily about a mental remembering, but it's taking action on something that you have just thought about. So it would be like if maybe I know of a friend who's having trouble paying rent and I can sakar by giving him some money to pay for rent. It would be a way of acting on his need. So it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with mentally thinking about him, even though I guess in a way it is connected, but it's more to do with the action that I take, because oftentimes this Hebrew word zakar is followed by an accompanying action. God does something when he quote unquote remembers or zakars somebody in scripture. And that's possible. I think you may even get some people who would look at this and say that maybe, just maybe, we should read this at face value. The word does mean to remember. And the people who wrote these stories were living in a culture where the gods could forget things. They could have things that they didn't know. The average god in the ancient Near East was not an omniscient being. They didn't know all. So some commentators have suggested that the Bible actually depicts a progression of how people thought about God over time, that these descriptions aren't necessarily how God exactly is, but how people understand him to be. And I think that's possible. I think it's possible to take this view and still have a high view of God and Scripture. This isn't just people trying to tear the Bible down. And if you think about it, there are some interesting occurrences, especially earlier on in the stories of the Bible, where God seems to not know certain things. Like he asks Adam and Eve where they are. He asks Cain what happened to Abel. Some people even point out that it seems like he didn't realize what happened to Abel until he got close enough to, quote unquote, hear the blood. We'll see at the end of this chapter that God gets close enough to smell the sacrifice that Noah offers. So you have things like this where God asks questions to things that we would think he should know, or something like this where he remembers something which could imply that he forgot about something. So maybe this isn't actually saying Yahweh really did forget about this guy Noah, but it's saying that the way that these people understood gods at the time, they could forget. So this was the best way that they understood God, and they were working with it. And then as time went on, their ideas of God refined and became greater. It's not until we get later on in the biblical story that we run into those verses that are often used to say that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, present everywhere. But that's definitely not the majority position for Christians, and I don't think that's necessarily what you have to take here. Interestingly enough, the word zakar doesn't just mean to remember, it also means to mention or to name. And I couldn't find any commentaries that went this route. I was a little surprised on this, because I think there could be a play on God's naming Adam all the way back in chapter 2. Granted, it is a different word than the one used in that chapter, but I think it could be somehow tying those two together. Just like God named Adam, now we have him with a different verb that can mean to name, and he does that with the new Adam, the one who is going to start over in a new creation after this flood. So that's more the route I'm going to go, is I think there's a tie-in there, but I did want to take a few minutes and draw attention to this because it's easy to gloss over and put our theology in front of the Bible. This happens all the time where people would look at something like this and say, well, God is omniscient. He knows everything. So he obviously can't remember because he can't forget. So this just can't mean what it seems to obviously mean. And the funny thing is, this is usually the same people who say that the plain sense of the text is the one to go with. So you're picking and choosing when you think the basic meaning of the text is the one to go with. And that's inconsistent. Now, we all do it, but the difference is some of us admit it. We all pick and choose when it comes to Bible interpretation, but not everybody admits that. Some people try to act as if they are completely consistent in their hermeneutics, in their Bible interpretation, but there are always times that we bend the rules. And that's okay. You just have to be honest about it when you do. So this is an instance where I think that we have to let the Bible dictate our theology, not our theology dictate the Bible. Don't come to something like this and say, because I believe God is XYZ, it can't possibly mean this in the text. Instead, we should let the text dictate our theology. We should come to this and say, well, that doesn't match what I think about God, so maybe I need to broaden my perspective on what is possible for God or what is true of God. That is a better way to go about it. The Bible dictates theology, not the other way around. I want to point out as well that God did not just zakar or remember or whatever you want to define that word as. He didn't just do that with Noah, but every living thing that was with him on the ark. Now, we get so focused on the humans in these stories because, well, that's us. But I think it's beautiful that God cares for the entirety of his creation. And he didn't just think about Noah and his family, he thought about the animals there as well. And remember that cattle here does not just mean cows, it is any beast, any sort of animal. At the end of the verse, we have God making a wind to pass over the earth. That word wind, it's the word ruach. That can be a breath, it can be a wind, it can be spirit, depending on the context. In Genesis 1:2, you had the ruach Elohim over the chaos waters, and now it's just reversed. It's the Elohim ruach. God made a wind over the earth. So this is taking us all the way back to the very start. It's like Genesis 1-7 has been the alpha test of the human experiment, and it didn't work. So this is now the beta test. This is the beginning of the new creation. So you basically have to think about Genesis 1-7 as being its own little encapsulated story. That is its own thing. And now we are starting on version 2 of that. Now let's look at this word assuaged here at the end of the verse. That's such a great King James word. I dare any of you to put the word assuaged in a sentence today and see how people respond. That would be wonderful. Please respond on our socials with how that went if you try that. But the word assuaged, it is a very interesting Hebrew word. It's the word shakak. It means to subside or to lessen. Now, it's not so much interesting by definition, but by how it's used, because it's a very rare word in the biblical story. It's only used 5 times, including this time right here in Genesis 8. 2 of the other times are in the book of Esther. Now, if I were to mention the book of Esther, I'm guessing that very few, if any of you, would think of a connection to the story of Noah. You might think about the young Jewish girl trying to hide her identity in the king's palace. You might think about the Jewish festival of Purim, but you're probably not thinking about Noah and the flood. And that's unfortunate because the biblical authors are trying desperately to get you to connect the 2 stories. Here's what I mean. If you were to look at the book of Esther, 2nd chapter, verse 1, it reads along these lines. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now, can you see a little bit of a connection in his remembering Vashti and God's remembering Noah? Now, that may not seem like much, but when you realize that the word translated appeased to talk about the wrath of the king is the same word shakak from our story in chapter 8, then the dots start to connect. Because Ahasuerus was appeased just like the waters of the flood were. Just like they started to recede and go down, his anger started to recede and go down. So the author of Esther is trying to get you to think about Ahasuerus as being compared to the chaotic floodwaters of Noah's story. And it matches because Ahasuerus is a very chaotic, unpredictable person throughout the book of Esther. At the very beginning, he throws this big party and calls out his sex slave wife Vashti to parade herself around in front of all of his friends there at the party while they're drunk. She understandably declines, he doesn't like that, sends her away from him for good, holds a beauty pageant and decides to get a new queen. That is an unpredictable sort of guy. And he makes these sort of snap decisions throughout the rest of the book where he probably should take more time to think about what he's doing. It gets him in hot water more than once. So he is very chaotic and unpredictable, just like the sea, just like the ocean waters. And in fact, it happens again at the end of the book when this word shows up in chapter 7 and his wrath is yet again appeased, that word shakak, when Haman is punished for trying to trick him. So even though you would probably never connect the stories of Esther and the flood together, they are intended to be read in light of each other. And this happens all across the Bible, where the authors will put together these hyperlinks. And it happens a lot with rare words like this, words that don't appear very often. And a lot of times they'll show up early on, often in the book of Genesis, and then only sprinkled a few times throughout the rest of the story. And when they show up, they're usually like a clue for us to reread the story that we're reading now in light of the story that it shows up in for the first time in Genesis. That happens a lot with relation to the flood account, because the flood account is full of pretty rare words that only show up in obscure passages, oftentimes the Psalms. And here's a great example of that, Psalm 63. You could read through Psalm 63 and not think that it has much of any connection at all to Noah and the flood. In fact, you'd be forgiven if you read it and didn't once think about Noah. But verse 11 has a key word at the end that makes you rethink the entire thing. And it's the simple word stopped. Verse 11 reads, "But the king will rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him will glory, but the mouth of them that speak lies will be stopped." That word stopped is the Hebrew word sakar, and it shows up only 2 times in the entirety of the Tanakh. Once in Psalm 63 and once in our story today. Genesis 8, verse 2, when it says that the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were stopped. So now the author of Psalm 63 is inviting you to reread the psalm in light of this new information. You get through the entire psalm, you're not thinking anything about Noah, and then he hits you right at the end with this word that is only used in Genesis 8, aside from that psalm. So it's kind of like when you have a movie with a surprise twist at the end, something like maybe Sixth Sense or Usual Suspects, where you think you know what's going on through the entire movie, but then within the last few minutes, you learn some new information that makes you rethink the entire thing. You almost have to just go back and rewatch the movie now in light of that information. That's what this is doing. You're reading Psalm 63. It seems totally normal and standalone, and then you get hit with this one hyperlink word that sends you back to the flood account. And it sort of makes you reread Psalm 63 as if the enemies he is speaking about are the chaotic floodwaters all around him. Really fascinating. Verse 3 says that the waters return from off the earth continually. And that reads kind of weird in Hebrew. Literally, it says the waters returned, going and returning. So that's very idiomatic. It's very repetitive, and it's almost giving you the impression just by its sound of waves going back and forth. In fact, just as the ark is said to walk on the waters in the previous chapter, see our episode last week for more on that if you missed it. So now the waters are actually said to walk in this verse. Again, very weird terminology that doesn't translate over well into English, but it's fascinating and kind of hyperlinks to the previous discussion from last week about the ark. In verse 4, we have to notice the sevens here because this is just too perfect. The ark rested. That word rest is Noah's name. It noacht in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month. So you have these 2 sevens showing up. And then I'll just jump ahead here to verse 5. You have the waters decreasing until the 10th month. And in the 10th month on the 1st day of the month. So you have very deliberate mentions of specific days that would be significant. So you have these sevens, you have 10, and you have it on the 1st day. It's almost too perfect the way that it works out, but the narrator is trying to draw this story to a crescendo where we see the new creation starting in an even grander way than the original creation. The original creation was just a 7-day thing, and now we have this on the 7th month and the 17th day. So it's all connected back to Genesis 1. This is like doubling the sevens in that, if you will. Now, let's talk about where the ark lands, because this is a pretty popular topic of debate. A lot of people will tell you it's on Mount Ararat, but that's not what the text says. Any good translation, if you go back and check it out, will actually say that the ark rested on the mountains, plural, of Ararat. Whatever the biblical text has in mind when it says Ararat, it is thinking about a mountain range, not a specific mountain. And there is even debate about what range or set of mountains this Ararat actually was. A lot of times people will go for something in the area of modern-day Turkey, but there's also guesses about Armenia. There's all kinds of options in the general Mesopotamia area for what this Ararat could be. Some biblical scholars think that it's actually the Hebrew word for the ancient kingdom of Urartu. Ultimately, we do not know exactly where the ark landed. And so all of those things that you might see on History Channel specials or read about in old books from the 80s or something like that about the ark being found, I hate to burst the bubble, but that's not accurate. That very well may be something that people found or saw, but there is absolutely no indication that that is the ark. Nothing in the Bible says that the ark rested on what we think of today as Mount Ararat. In fact, it probably was somewhere else. And that's okay. We do not need to know where the ark landed in order to get any meaning out of this story. This is something where I think we actually lose the meaning of the story when we focus so much on trying to find the location of the ark. Some people get ridiculously obsessive over this. And if it's something that interests you, that's fine. You can be interested in it. But don't let this become the main point of the story for you. If you're trying to find Where was this ark? It really just becomes about people trying to find proof of the Bible. They're trying to find the gotcha for people who don't believe the text. They want to be able to find the ark somewhere and say, see, we gotcha. The story was true all along. And that misses the point entirely, and it makes Christians look stupid to the rest of the world because we're just arguing over where an ancient boat landed. Listen, the Bible is not interested in giving you relics. This is not Raiders of the Lost Ark. We're not trying to find the Ark of the Covenant or pieces of the cross of Christ or the Holy Grail or the Ark or anything else. That's not what the Bible's trying to do. It's not a treasure map to finding these relics. And there's even no indication that these things could have or would have survived. People sometimes talk about finding wood or something on the top of Mount Ararat that they think is the same Ararat from the Bible. Well, even if you do find wood there, that doesn't prove it's the Ark. And a lot of times people are looking for a boat. Well, like we've talked about, the Ark wasn't a boat. It was a giant coffin. It was a giant box. There's no rudder. There's no keel. You're not going to find some captain's wheel on this. And if you did, that wouldn't be the Ark. So all you're looking for is some wood up there? Well, that could be anything. And how do you know that proves the biblical story? What if it proved one of the other ancient flood myths? What if it was just somebody's house that they built up there or some structure that was up there? And people say, oh, well, they found bits of animal hair or something like that. Okay, well, maybe it was somebody's house and they had animals there. Maybe after the place fell apart and became ruins, animals wandered around there. See, it doesn't actually prove anything when you just take a second to step back and think about it. And we don't need it to prove anything. The Bible isn't the kind of book where we're supposed to be going out and seeing, oh, where did this happen? Let's find the exact spot. There's nothing mystical about it. There's nothing magical about it. And this happens all the time, even with like trips to the Holy Land sort of thing, when people would tour around Israel and they want to see the Garden Tomb, they want to see Golgotha, they want to see the Via Dolorosa, where Jesus walked with the cross, all of these different sites. And a lot of times they're just tourist traps. Good biblical scholars will tell you we don't know where these locations were exactly. And even if we did, they don't hold any kind of residual supernatural power. Now, they might hold some personal significance, and that's okay, and people like to go to these places and feel warm and full and something spiritual. But just being honest with you, a lot of times they happen in places where these stories didn't actually happen. So what a lot of those people is feeling is the hype of what these places have been made out to be. And I'm sure if people are ever able to get to the top of Ararat and see whatever the structure is that people see and they find some wood or something else, people will feel validated in their faith. And I don't want to take that away, but by the same token, if your faith is being bolstered by something that isn't accurate, it hurts your faith more than it helps it. And I'd rather tear that down and let your faith stand on something stronger than let you hold on to a misconception that could easily be torn down by someone with less charitable motivations than I have. So we have a lot of problems here. 1, we don't know the actual location. 2, there's no guarantee this stuff would have survived thousands of years of weathering. 3, even if it did, there's no actual spiritual significance to it. It would just be some pieces of wood. And 4, when you try to pin down these sorts of relics, you're missing the point of the text. People get so up in arms about where exactly Ararat was that they miss the connections in the Hebrew language of what this verse is trying to say. See, if we go back to Genesis 5:28, this is talking about Noah's father Lamech and when Noah is born. And Lamech says, this is verse 29 of chapter 5, he called his name Noach, saying, this same will comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands. And that word comfort is kind of sort of ishly related to Noah's name. We talked about that when we went through chapter 5. It sounds like Noach. Because of the ground which Yahweh had cursed. And that word cursed is the word arara. So this Noach was supposed to bring Noach rest because of the arara, the curse. Here we are in chapter 8, and you have the ark that Noach's on the mountain of Ararat. Do you see the similarity? Noach and Arara versus Ararat. There's this wonderfully clever bit of wordplay going on, and it gets completely lost by people who are totally missing the point of the passage. TLDR on that is we don't actually know where the ark landed or if any part of it would still exist today. Interestingly enough, some of the other ancient flood myths do mention specific locations for where their boats landed. The Gilgamesh epic, for instance, says that the boat landed on Mount Nisir, which is in the general region of Kurdistan today in the Middle East. Verse 5 gives us a little more on the timeline, that this is now in the 10th month, in the first day of the month. And then we have in verse 6 another 40 days. Now, we mentioned last week, the timeline here is really hard to pin down, because there's different ways that you can read this. If sometimes the 40 days are part of the 150, where exactly the rain starts and ends, and there's just all kinds of confusing bits on that. But I think the general idea is to see the point of God's remembering as the pivot in the story. And it seems like the times are meant to kind of be inverse of each other. It's not a perfect match, but like you have the 7 days at the very start before it rains, and then you have the 40 days, and then you have 150 days. Now you have 150 days again. You're about to have 40 days, and then we'll have a couple of 7s after that. So it's not a perfect symmetry, but it kind of works, and I think that's what it's going for. And the Bible Project has a neat graph where they show chapter 8, verse 1 of God's remembering Noah as the pivot point in the story. I've included the link to that article in the show notes on our website, so you can definitely check that out there. It's a very interesting article that goes into more depth about what it could mean that God remembered Noah. And it actually traces that theme through the rest of the Bible too, because that becomes a relatively common phrase for God to remember someone and then do something in relation to that. So be sure to check that out. Verse 6 says that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. I think that's a little bit odd because, well, who else would have made that? But it's there. So let's go into verse 7 and talk about the birds.
Well, everybody's heard about the bird. The birds are...
Because a lot of people know about Noah sending out the birds, but they might miss some of the significance of it. So I'm going to read a little bit of a lengthy section here from the IVP Bible Backgrounds commentary on the Old Testament. This is a really good commentary. I definitely recommend it. I know John Walton was one of the editors, and I think a couple other people with him as well. But they have a little bit of a long section here on the birds and their significance. I think it's worth reading. So they say, one of the enduring pictures of the Noah account is that of Noah sending out the birds to gain information about the conditions outside the ark. The flood stories in the Gilgamesh epic and the Atrahasis epic feature a similar use of birds. Rather than a raven and 3 missions for the dove, we find a dove, a swallow, and a raven sent out. The dove and swallow return without finding a place, while the raven is pictured, as in Genesis 8:7, as flying about, calling, and not returning. Ancient navigators were known to use birds to find land, but Noah is not navigating. He is on land. His use of the birds is not for the purpose of finding direction. It is also known that the flight patterns of birds sometimes served as omens, but neither Genesis nor Gilgamesh make observations from the flight of the birds sent out. Unlike pigeons or doves, which will return after being released, a raven's use to the sailor is based on its line of flight. By noting the direction it chooses, a sailor may determine where land is located. The most sensible strategy is to release a raven first, and then use other birds to determine the depth of the water and the likelihood of a place to land. A raven, by habit, lives on carrion and would therefore have sufficient food available. So just breaking in here for a second, what they're saying is that the raven can fly farther than these other birds. So it would go out in the direction of land. You might not be able to see the land from the ark, but the raven could go up higher and see. So he's going to go in a specific direction, say, north, south, east, west, whatever it would be. So then the next bird that you send out, you send in that same direction that the raven flew, but that bird won't have quite as far of a distance that it can fly. So it will come back sooner if it doesn't see the land close enough, but at least then it knows the direction it's going in. All right, back to IVP. The dove and the pigeon have a limited ability for sustained flight. Thus, navigators use them to determine the location of landing sites. As long as they return, no landing is in close range. The dove lives at lower elevations and requires plants for food. The olive leaf retrieved by the dove suggests the amount of time it would take for an olive tree to leaf out after being submerged, a clue to the current depth of the floodwaters. It is also symbolic of new life and fertility to come after the flood. The olive is a difficult tree to kill, even if cut down. The freshly plucked shoot shows Noah that recovery has begun. End of quote. Now, let's look at this dove in verse 9, because there's something that can be really easy to miss if we're not paying attention. Verse 9 reads, "But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot. And she returned unto him in the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole land, and he put forth his hand, took her, and pulled her unto him into the ark." Did you catch what was so weird? It's right there at the beginning. The dove found no rest for the sole of her foot. When is the last time you talked about a bird having a sole of a foot? That's kind of weird. And using Michael Heiser's laws of biblical interpretation, if it's weird, it's important. And this is a great example of that. There are so many ways that the author could have said that the bird didn't find any place for it to rest, for it to land, anything like that. But it says there was no rest for the sole of her foot. And again, that word rest is Noah's name, Noach, for the sole of her foot. Believe it or not, this hyperlinks ahead to the book of Joshua, when the children of Israel are getting ready to begin their military conquest into the land of Canaan, and Joshua is prepping the people on how they're going to cross over Jordan. Joshua 3:13 reads this way. See if you can pick up on some of the hyperlinks. It will come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests that bear the ark of Yahweh, Lord over all the earth, will rest in the waters of Jordan, that the waters of Jordan will be cut off from the waters that came down from above, and they will stand on a heap. Did you catch anything? Let's start with the priests. They more than likely would have been wearing white. What color is a dove? White. All right. And it says that as soon as the soles of their feet touch the water, you have a dove that couldn't find Noach for the sole of its foot because of the waters. So as soon as these priests have their feet, the sole of their feet specifically, touch the waters are going to part. Now, let's pause for a second and look at what the priests are carrying. An ark. Now, this is a different word for ark. This is Aron instead of Teva. But I think the connection is still there. So you have people dressed in white like a dove. You have the soles of their feet over water. You have an ark. And then it says that the waters of Jordan will be cut off from the waters that come down from above. That is a really weird thing to say about a river. The waters that are above, that's like rain. That's the cosmic ocean above that the ancients would have thought was in the sky. But when you connect it to the story of Noah, where those waters above and the waters below had come crashing down on each other in an act of decreation, now you can see that this is actually hyperlinking not just to the Noah story, but all the way back to creation when God separated the waters from the waters. So here you have in Joshua the story connecting Noah and the dove over the chaos waters, as well as God splitting the chaos waters back in Genesis 1 as the people now move into the land that they were supposed to make like a new Eden, just as Noah is getting off of his mini Eden and is about to start his own Eden again with a garden that we will see next week. But wait, there's more. Because back in Genesis 1, how is the Spirit of God described? As hovering over the chaos waters. In fact, a lot of translations will say hovering or flitting or fluttering or something along those lines because it's the imagery of a bird over the waters. Now, hold on, because we're going to go to maximum warp. We're going 5 here, Mr. Sulu. Go all the way up to the time of the Gospels. And we have Jesus being baptized. And at his baptism, the Spirit of God descends like a dove over the waters. And not just any waters, the waters of the Jordan. The very same where Joshua crossed and where the priests dressed almost like doves carrying an ark went across the waters. Hyperlinking back to Noah, hyperlinking back to Genesis 1. So we have all of these stories in a row connected to each other. Creation in Genesis 1, the flood here in chapter 8, Joshua's conquest going into the land in the book of Joshua, and then even all the way up to Jesus' baptism. It's mind-blowing, but this is exactly how the Bible works, and it is so awesome. I think there's even a little bit of a hyperlink in how Noah puts out his hand and takes the bird back. That is very similar to the language used in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where the angels reach out and pull Lot back into the house. I think it could even maybe be like a contrast to Eve's reaching out and taking the fruit from the tree. And the language there is a little bit different, but I think there could be just enough to make some sort of a connection. Bible Project has pointed out very astutely that this kind of maps onto one of the purification rituals from Leviticus, where after something happens that makes you ritually impure, you would have to wait 7 days. And then you would bring a dove. Well, what happens here in this story? Noah sends out the raven, and then he sends out the dove, and then the dove comes back. He waits 7 days, sends out the dove again. So in Leviticus, in this purification ritual, you wait 7 days, and you bring a dove. And a lot of times, oil was included in this purification ritual. What does the dove bring back in Noah's story? An olive branch. olive oil. Come on, that's a little too coincidental. I think that's a great connection that they made. I love it. Note in verse 11 that the dove came back to Noah in the evening. Here we go again, bringing us back new creation language. Just like each of the days of creation was evening and morning, here we have life that Noah is finding in the evening. That word translated plucked, as the old King James puts it, it actually means fresh. And so a lot of translations will say freshly plucked. It gets the idea across. Verse 13 says, "It came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, in the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry." Now, you may notice if you're using a translation that has italics, there are a handful here where it talks about the first month and first day of the month. It's really just saying the first of the month. And it's ever so slightly one letter off of Bereshit, the word from the very beginning of Genesis that is translated in the beginning. So here we go again with new creation language. And this first day of the first month, that's also the date of the Passover in Exodus 12. It's the date of the tabernacle's completion in Exodus 40. So it becomes a very significant day. It's the new year to them. It's the first day of the first month, like January 1st would be to us. But a lot of significant things happen in the Bible on the first day of the first month, and this is the very beginning of that here. So all of those times that you see first day, first month, later on in the story, they are hyperlinking back to this new creation life that is found after the flood. As for the covering in this verse, we talked about that in our episode on Genesis 6. That was all the way back at episode 20, because that doesn't show up in the descriptions of the ark when Noah is supposed to be building it. And there's some strange possibilities of what that exactly could be. So if you haven't listened to episode 12, I recommend you go back and check that out. It will explain what that might be. Verse 14 says, "In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the 27th day, the earth dried, and God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with thee. Bring forth every living creature that is with you, of all flesh, of fowls, of cattle, every creeping thing, that they may breed abundantly in the earth and be fruitful and multiply in the earth." You should definitely be picking up on some Genesis 1 and 2 language there. It's like a new creation blessing. And if I can spiritualize for just a second here, Noah and his family had been in that ark for roughly around a year, probably a little bit more, depending on how you measure the time. It was a place that kept them safe. It had all of the supplies and resources that they needed for that time. But there came a time when they had to leave the ark. Just because something used to be a comfort or a means of salvation or significance to you previously doesn't mean it always will be. It can be very tempting to stay where we are comfortable when there's something unfamiliar in the dangerous world out there. But God calls all of us at some point in our lives to leave the ark, the place of security, and start out fresh in new life. If they had stayed in the ark, they wouldn't have been able to begin new lives. They needed to go out. That doesn't mean the ark wasn't a good thing for them before, but it means that it was no longer what was best for them. And that is often true for us as well. We have to talk about Noah's sacrifice, because as soon as he and the animals and his family leave the ark, verse 20 says that Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean beast and every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled a sweet savor, and Yahweh said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night will not cease. So Noah comes out from the waters, and he worships God on the mountain above. This is going to become kind of a popular theme, as Israel will eventually go through the waters and then worship God on the other side. And this is possibly something we'll get to do an episode on. I am definitely considering it. But I think the Apostle Peter connects these ideas with the concept of baptism. 1 Peter 3 actually ties baptism back to Noah's Ark, and it's a really weird passage with some really wonky stuff in it that definitely needs to be its own episode at some point. So I have that in the works eventually. I'm not sure when we'll get around to it, but I think there's a hyperlink there as well that we can store away for another time. Now, regarding Noah's sacrifice, the IVP Bible Background Commentary again notes that altars are a common element in many religions, ancient and modern. In the Bible, altars were usually constructed of stone, hewn or unhewn, but in certain circumstances, even a large rock would suffice. Many believe that the altar would have been understood as the table for the deity, since sacrifices were popularly understood as providing a meal for the god, though that imagery is not easily recognized in the Old Testament. The purpose of Noah's sacrifice is not stated. Now, this is me stepping in here. I think that's really important that we notice that because there's a lot we can assume about this. So just realize up front, the purpose is not stated, nor is exactly stated what the offering itself was. So that's what the IVP continues with now. The text calls them burnt offerings, which served a broad function in the sacrificial system. It may be more important to note what the text does not call the sacrifice. It is not a sin offering, nor specifically designated a thank offering. The burnt offerings are usually associated with petitions or entreaties set before God. In contrast, the sacrifice offered after the flood in the Gilgamesh epic and in the earlier Sumerian version of the flood story features libations and grain offerings as well as meat sacrifices in order to provide a feast for the gods. The general purpose for sacrifice in the ancient world was to appease the anger of the gods by gifts of food and drink, and that is probably the intentions of the flood hero in the Mesopotamian accounts. Pause there for a second. This is significant because nowhere in the Bible at this point does God say, to anyone, I want you to make a sacrifice. Now, this is only the second sacrifice we've had in the story so far, the first being with Cain and Abel in chapter 4. But in neither that story nor in this one do we have God saying to do this. It is entirely by the volition of the humans in the story. Now, it could very well be that God off camera instructed them on what kind of offerings to give and why that was important and what he actually wanted. But we can't make an argument from silence. So as far as we know, these are humans trying to make some petition to these gods, get the attention of these gods. And we don't have time at all to get into why that was significant or what the significance may have been to them. That is easily a full podcast episode, if not series, for the future. But there was something about the blood of the sacrifice that was intended to get the attention of a deity. And in some cases, it could be as a thank you for something that the deity did. It could also be a petition asking them to do something for you. And kind of another version of that, as Walton and the others mentioned here, is that it could be trying to appease the wrath of a god. Now that's important because if you remember from earlier on, we said that the text never actually describes God as angry here. So I have to step in and wonder, did God actually want this from Noah? The text never says that. In fact, the text never even says that he liked the sacrifice. It says that he smelled a sweet smell from it, and he decided that he wasn't going to curse the ground again, but it doesn't actually say that he appreciated or even accepted the offering. I think that might be implied, but I think we have to look at this and go, did God actually want Noah to do this? He already saved him from this, so he wasn't angry at Noah and his family, and like we talked about already, nothing in the text even says he was angry at the rest of humanity. If anything, it just says that he was saddened by it, felt some form of anxiety over it even. So I have to wonder if maybe Noah was just, scared. I mean, think about what being locked in a box with a bunch of animals and 7 other humans for a year would do to a person's psyche. It would drive you crazy. And next week, we're going to talk about what Noah and his family did after the flood. The first thing we see Noah doing after building this altar is he goes and he plants a garden and he builds a vineyard in that garden and he gets drunk. Now, I realize that would have taken time for the grapes to grow and to ferment and everything, but it's almost as if we're meant to see this as his rushing to get drunk. And I think we can kind of sympathize with Noah in that, because if you were the last person alive on the earth or in your land, and you had to listen to everybody else dying around you while you were the only ones surviving in this ark, that would really mess with a guy. So I'm kind of thinking that he may have just had such a broken psyche at this point that he was doing anything to try to not have this God do to him what was done to all these other people. And I don't honestly even think that was necessary. So the text doesn't really tell us one way or the other whether this was a good move or not on the part of Noah. I think there are some implications that it's looked upon favorably. You know, the fact that there were clean animals there in the first place implies that maybe a sacrifice could have been expected, but it's not as cut and dry as many people would make it out to be. The IVP goes on to note that sacrifice here, as well as throughout the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books, is said to produce a pleasing aroma, terminology that was retained from the ancient contexts in which sacrifice was viewed as food for the deity. This account falls far short of the graphic description in the Gilgamesh epic, where the famished gods, deprived for food for the duration of the flood, gather around the sacrifice like flies, glad to find reprieve from starvation. End of quote. I think that's important as well, because burning animal flesh isn't exactly the most pleasant odor, especially if it's not just like the meat that's being cooked. Like a steak on the grill might smell good, but if you just threw an animal on there, that ain't gonna smell good. And nothing indicates that they took any time to skin them or anything along those lines. So the fact that it's described as a sweet smell is really weird to us, but we have to remember the ancient context where this is about feeding the gods. And that's not necessarily to say that the biblical authors are making that same assertion about Yahweh, but that's the water they swam in. That's the air they breathed. That was their culture. And so it seeps into their writing. Now, there's an interesting trend throughout the biblical story of sacrifices that people make and what happens to the person who sacrificed. See, the first sacrifice with Cain and Abel, the one who sacrificed became a sacrifice. Abel offered to God, and he was killed for it. And I think there's implication in the text even that Cain killed him like a sacrifice. Now, Noah is not sacrificed in this story, but he is taken advantage of by his family, which we'll get to in the next chapter. The next person to make a sacrifice in the biblical story is Abraham. And just like Noah was 10 generations from Adam, Abraham is 10 generations from Noah. And the sacrifice that Abraham is most well known for, that of Isaac, is where one of the sacrificers, Isaac, becomes the sacrifice himself. And then it goes even further into the Torah in Exodus 32. Moses makes atonement without an altar by offering himself as a sacrifice before God to the people. So there's these really interesting themes throughout these first couple of books, and I think you can even draw a line straight up to Jesus as the sacrifice for humanity. That's a great connection that the Bible Project has made in the past. They've also observed that just like humanity soaked the land in blood, God soaked the land in water. And now a human offered a blood sacrifice in an orderly manner. Part of the reason for the flood in the first place was all of the bloodshed, where it was just seeping into the earth in a chaotic manner. There was no purpose to it. It's not like it was killing for war or legal reasons or something like that, like as a punishment. It was just people murdering each other. And a sacrifice is the opposite of that. It is an orderly way to shed blood. And that is a very different way of thinking about it than we would in the modern world, but it fits that ancient context. Now, notice what God says about his reasoning for not flooding the earth again. In verse 21, he says, "I will not again curse the ground anymore for your humanity's sake, because the imagination of humanity's heart is evil from his youth." Do you recognize that? That is the exact same reason given in the previous chapter for why God sent the flood in the first place. He sent the flood because the imagination of everyone's heart was evil. And his reason now for saying he would not do it again is because the imagination of everyone's heart is evil. So the reasons for the flood and for not flooding the earth again are the exact same. And that comes across really weird to some people. But I think it's making a very poignant statement. This is God's promising never to be a helicopter parent again. A helicopter parent is the terminology used for a parent who is a little too overprotective of a child. They're constantly hovering over their kid and trying to take care of every little thing for them and micromanaging their life. A lot of times people wonder why God doesn't micromanage. Why doesn't an all-powerful, all-good God change all of this stuff? Why doesn't he step in? Why doesn't he fix our problems? Well, this is the answer to that question. Right here, God says the reason I'm not going to step in and fix everything for you is because if I did that, I would be doing it every several years. So the end of the flood account here in chapter 8 is God's promise never to be a helicopter parent again. It's his giving us a chance to fix ourselves. Think about it as like a parent that has 2 kids that are fighting. The parent can step in and correct the 2 kids, or they can let them solve the issue between themselves. And how well that works might depend on the age of the kids and their experience and all of that. But there's more meaning if the kids are able to come to a resolution themselves. If the parent steps in every time and corrects them and solves the problem for them, they are creating dependence on that parent. Whereas if the kids are able to learn this on their own, they'll have the skills for when they grow up and the parents aren't there. They're not going to expect them to fix every issue. So I think this is God's purposefully stepping back and saying, I want you to learn to fix your own problems. I don't want to have to step in every time and change this. I want to give you a chance to get better on your own. Oh, before I forget, I also meant to mention that the word translated sweet in the sweet savor that God smells from the altar, the sacrifice, it's the word nihuak. So you can hear a play on Noah's name, Noach, in nihuak there. It's pretty similar. Robert Alter has made a great note on the idiom said to himself, where God says to himself or in his heart that he's not going to curse the ground again. He says it's important to preserve the literal wording because it pointedly echoes Genesis 6 verse 6, where God was grieved to the heart, just as the devisings of the human heart are evil, explicitly echoes chapter 6 verse 5. The flood story is thus enclosed by mutually mirroring reports of God's musing on human nature. God concludes that given what man is all too likely disposed to do, it is scarcely worth destroying the whole world again on his account. End of quote. So the text saying that God said this in his heart parallels with the earlier mention from chapter 6 about his hurting in his heart about humanity. We also have to talk about the curse mentioned here, because this is kind of weird when you stop and think about it. And it's not the same word for curse from Genesis 3, but there is no curse mentioned in the flood narrative. There is no indication that God has cursed anything else since chapter 3 when he curses the ground and the serpent. And then chapter 4, he does have the curse on Cain. But there's nothing else that has indicated any other curse since then. In fact, the verse literally reads, I will not continue to curse the ground anymore. So I think the implication here of these verses is that the curse stopped at the end of the flood, that God removed the curse and that we've restarted in a land without a curse. Now that's really weird because most Christians would say that the curse has continued and we still live on a cursed earth, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It actually appears that God was actively making the earth small in what it would produce. That's the meaning of curse here in this text, not just curse like in the sense of a hex, but the word actually means to make small or to denigrate or even to vilify, as Robert Alter has also noted in his commentary. So it seems like in the end of chapter 3 through chapter 7, God is actively making the production of anything from the land very difficult. And after the flood, he says, you know what, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm just going to let things go on their own. So even though we still have thorns and thistles and all of that that's mentioned at the end of chapter 3, it sounds like the curse is no longer on the earth and that we are actually living in a world that doesn't have God's curse upon it. That can really change the way that you view the world. And I would say even the people in it, when we realize that God looks on this land with favor, and he has not cursed it. He has actually said that in this version of the human experiment, from the flood onward, he is not going to actively work against us. If anything, he's actually going to be working on our side, trying to help us and improve humanity. There's also poetry going on in his not cursing the Adamah, the ground, anymore for the sake of Ha'adam, the human. Notice that in verse 22, agriculture, weather, and time are mentioned in the reverse order of Genesis 1, 3 through 13. So in those stories, you have time being established, weather with the sun, moon, stars. You have agriculture with the plants being cultivated. But here, God says that seed time, harvest, summer, winter, day, and night will not cease. So it's the reverse order from Genesis 1. I think there could also be a little bit of a dig going on at ancient deities, a little bit of an insult in verse 22, because a lot of ancient deities were considered to control seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, even day and night. And this verse is saying, actually, Yahweh's the one who determines all of them. So yeah, our God's bigger than your God. And we'll talk about this more next week, but note that there is nothing here about never flooding the earth again. This becomes a big deal when we start talking about eschatology, end time sort of things, and people will look at a couple of passages in the New Testament that can make it sound like God is going to destroy this world with fire and start over. And a lot of times you kind of start to draw in comparisons to when he destroyed the earth with water here in the flood. And they'll say, well, God promised never to destroy the earth with a flood, so he has to do it with fire this time. That's another conversation for another day, and I do plan to have that conversation before too long. But I just want to point out that as of where we are right now in this, God does not say that he will never flood the earth again. He just says that he is not going to destroy all of humanity again. So he says, I will not curse the ground anymore, neither will I smite anymore every living thing as I have done. No mention of I'll never send a flood again. It's just I am never going to destroy humanity again. That plays a big role when you start talking about how do we move from this age into the next one. Because this would imply that God is actually not just going to wipe everything out and start over, like a lot of Christians think is going to happen when he destroys the world in fire and begins again. Again, another conversation for another day, so that's just a teaser right now. But realize that as of this passage, the text is indicating that God does not ever have plans of destroying the earth again. Now that Noah and his family are off of the ark, it is time to begin humanity again, and this is where we will pick up next week as we look at chapter 9. We'll have some big controversies that we'll get into next week. We're going to continue our discussion of whether or not God will ever destroy the earth again, and if so, how. We'll talk about humans eating meat. We're also going to cover what happens with Noah when he gets drunk and why he curses Canaan and what that means for people today, if anything. So quite a bit that we have to cover next week, but it should be a very interesting discussion. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.